God showed me something profound recently in Isaiah 52, and it's in verse 13 when he's prophesying about Jesus through Isaiah, and he says, my servant will be highly exalted and he will prosper. Then in verse 14, the very next verse, he says, but when people saw him, they were shocked because he was so disfigured, he seemed hardly human. And then the next verse, he speaks about how that he will startle kings and he will do this and he will do that, right? And when I read that, I was thinking, verse 13, you just said he would prosper. And the next verse, you're saying he was harmed to the point that he was disfigured and seemed hardly human, which refers to the cross. And God just taught me through that how that sometimes when He gives us a promise, the promise awakens suffering, the promise awakens trials, the promise awakens pain. In the middle of the promise, when God gives us a promise, and the next phase we are facing of trials and suffering, it can look like how this suffering doesn't look like what He promised. Because who would have seen Jesus on the cross and think that that looked like the restoration of mankind? But that was the restoration of mankind. And God showed me that the suffering is an assurance of the promise, that the suffering is there to show you that the promise will eventually be fulfilled. And I could relate with that so much because in the suffering, I can doubt that God is going to fulfill the promise because the suffering and the promise sometimes don't look any alike. But God was telling me that the suffering is the sign, the suffering is the assurance, the suffering is the stamp that that promise is going to be fulfilled. And the suffering is what equips me, is what equips you, is what equips you to receive the fulfillment of the promise. And this is to tell you that if you receive the promise from God and it looks like what is happening in your life right now is the opposite or is worse or is terrible than what God has said, I want to remind you that the suffering is the sign that the promise is going to be fulfilled. And what you need to do is to trust the Lord and hold on to Him and pour out your stuff, pour out your questions, pour out your anger, but in everything, let be holding on to the Lord because the Lord who will lead you through the valley will also take you up the mountain.